going to go ahead and get started. I hope you've had a chance to get some coffee and breakfast. I wanted to, of course, welcome you to this Government Analytics Breakfast Forum. I'm Jennifer Bachner. I direct the Master of Science in Government Analytics here at Johns Hopkins. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the degree, it's a relatively new program that provides students with the quantitative skills that are needed for data-driven decision-making in the public sector. We offer this breakfast series approximately every other month along with REI systems, and the purpose is to bring together professionals in academia, government, and industry to discuss various ways in which analytic methods are being used to solve governance and policy challenges in the public sector. And we very much welcome your input both during and after the presentation. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to those who are joining us via the live stream. We welcome your participation as well, and I believe that you can enter in questions right below the video. There should be a chat space. If you're so inclined, you can certainly tweet about the event using the hashtag GAB Forum, GAB Forum. And please note that a recording of the event will be posted both on the Johns Hopkins and the REI Systems websites following the event, probably 24 hours after or so. We very much appreciate, again, you taking time out of your busy days to participate. Before I officially turn the program over to Jeff Myers to introduce our distinguished speaker, I wanted to mention that in your packets that you picked up at registration, you'll find 3 guest columns that are written by Jeff Myers of REI Systems. They were published in FedScoop, and they describe some potential next steps for the Data Act, so I encourage you to take a look at those. So with that, I will turn the program over to Jeff Myers.
Thanks very much, Jen, and thanks very much also to Johns Hopkins. I think the university is doing great things, and I think is interested in engaging fully not only with kind of students who are just finishing their education, but also students in ongoing programs. I want to mention just briefly a couple of kind of suggestions about this overall type of event and then get into the specifics with Dave Liebrich. This event is intended to try and help create kind of and strengthen a community, so we hope that you'll interact with each other about government analytics. And in particular, we're going to kind of go on a hiatus for the summer and then start up again the second Wednesday of each month, beginning in September and then November and then January. And I just wanted to share with you kind of a couple of ideas to stoke your interest and find out what you would like to provide feedback about for subsequent events. One of the ideas is potentially a panel of grant makers about use of analytics to both evaluate and improve grantee impact, so agencies that issue grants. Another is a top executive from the General Services Administration saying essentially how leadership uses analytics where the environment they work in is an operational environment and is rich in data about their operations. A third is a manager from SSA, Social Security Administration, who has been very successful in persuading frontline staff to use analytics as opposed to just kind of pure judgment in making their day-to-day decisions. So those are the types of topics we're thinking about. None of the speakers for the fall are set. We usually try and set them about 2 months in advance. So what I hope is that you'll think about who you'd like to hear from and what sorts of topics you'd like to hear as part of a kind of collaborative discussion. And with that, let me turn over to describing first a little bit of background about Dave, and then second kind of why I thought he would be a strong interest in his presentation here. Dave and I are classmates from graduate school quite a while back. We don't need to name the specific date. But Dave has been at Treasury since graduate school. He's actually more consistent and stable in his employment than almost anybody I know. And his roles at Treasury started out as a presidential management intern and continued on through responsibility as both the Treasury Department's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fiscal Operations and Policy, Deputy Director, then Acting Director of the U.S. Mint, Commissioner of the Financial Management Service, Commissioner of the Bureau of the Fiscal Service, which includes that Financial Management Service as well as the Bureau of Public Debt, and now the most senior career official in the entire Treasury Department as the as the Fiscal Assistant Secretary. I've asked Dave to give a little bit of an overview about the Data Act because he has responsibility at Treasury for overseeing its implementation, and a little bit of an overview about kind of what's happened over the past year since its passage. But I've actually asked him also to focus a little bit more on the future, and in particular what agencies might want to do and what he hopes they will do with the data from the Data Act. Because after all, hopefully this is not a compliance exercise, but this is something that will produce value from the data that is available. And so I hope that you'll enjoy his comments and his presentation, and as well that we're going to reserve ideally about a half hour for your questions. So I hope that you'll have a number of questions for him from any variety of different perspectives. And with that, and actually I forgot to mention, Dave is well educated. He has both an AD in economics as well as a Master in Public Policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So please give Dave your thanks for joining us. And Dave, take it away.
That's a good beginning right there. Let's see if I can make sure I can figure out how the technology works too here. That's always a real challenge for me. But thank you all for being here today. I know a Monday morning like this is very nice for you all to come out. And thank you, Johns Hopkins, for sponsoring this. I wanted to go through a couple things. I think Jeff did a really nice job of framing the discussion today, which is the Data Act passed a year ago, so I think it's important and relevant to go back and talk a little bit more about what actually the Act wants us to do and is asking us to do, about what we've done over the course of the last year. And I think really the bulk of the conversation, I hope we can open this up to questions and answers about how do we want to move forward in the future of using data in government. I think we're off to a very good start. This is a tough challenge that we have. How do you move the federal government forward really as an entity? And I don't think that people from the outside probably can fully appreciate how big and how complex the federal government is. But it is huge. Now I know that because in my job, one of the jobs Jeff mentioned as Commissioner of the Fiscal Service, I was responsible for issuing $7 trillion of Treasury securities every year, of making over $1 billion payments, totaling over $3.1 trillion, and collecting trillions of dollars of receipts from the IRS in different places, the debt collection function that we have, and trying to make sure that we're collecting money, hard-earned money that's owed back to the federal government. And also a very important element is financial reporting. We do something called the Financial Report of the United States Government, which is trying to compile in its entirety all the activity and spending that occurs across government. And it is enormous. So when you make changes and when you're asking to move forward and do things differently, it's not as you're working in a small bureau or a small agency or a small business. It's just really the biggest entity in the world, and therefore it can be difficult. Also, we live in a very difficult time in terms of budget constraints and shrinking spending, much more scrutiny on federal spending than perhaps there's been in the past. The Data Act in some ways is a result of that, and it's an extension of FFATA, which was designed to actually bring more transparency to federal government and federal spending. I don't know if that's, there we go. And so, I'll just read just quickly from the legislation itself. The purpose of the Act is expand the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act of 2006 by disclosing direct federal agency expenditures and linking federal contract, loan, and grant spending information to programs of federal agencies to enable taxpayers and policymakers to track federal spending more effectively. Establish government-wide data standards for financial data and provide consistent, reliable, and searchable government-wide spending data that is displayed accurately for taxpayers and policymakers. You'll note there's a lot of emphasis there on taxpayers and policymakers, which I think they may mean congressional members as policymakers. I'm not so sure they mean federal agencies, although we could ask a little bit more about that. I do think that what's been very encouraging to me as we have started in this process is how much this Act has resonated with federal financial managers. So while the Act talks a lot about taxpayers and policymakers and sort of really focusing on the public, as Dave Mader and I from OMB have gone around and spoken to people, the reason why we've been able to move the federal government forward is because they do see the value in having better access to data. And part of it is right now, and we recently did an update to the USA spending, and one of the surprising things that we found in that process is how many federal agencies are actually using USA spending to get access to their own data. It's because the data is siloed, it's in different systems, it's not easily accessible, and therefore they're looking for a central or a more comprehensive database to actually get access to information. And that speaks a little bit to these systems, and I mentioned the federal contracts and grants and loans. These systems were not designed necessarily to speak to one another. They were designed for specific purposes, and generally that was to administer those programs. And it was not they weren't necessarily designed to share the information. The linkages to the core financial system sometimes are ambiguous. And so it's very difficult to extract that information from any single place. And so I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about how we try to approach this dilemma as we try to implement the Data Act. But it is I'll just come back, it's a huge challenge. There are over 48 different core financial management systems with government. There are an enormous number of loans and grants systems that are there, these corollary systems, and getting them to speak to one another and to actually move the information between systems is no small challenge. And it's potentially an expensive challenge. And I think that's one of the reasons why when this bill was passed, and it was passed with no funding associated with it, I think that there were many people who looked at it and said, don't think this is going to be very successful. Because if you're not going to fund something that is this difficult and complex, how are you going to move the ball down the field? And I think we've really tried to think through creatively about how we can use technology as sort of our friend or as a way to kind of advance things as an enabler so that you're not doing massive systems changes along the way. So I tend to think that while I know that there are some really daunting challenges, I also sort of think that there's an importance of having sort of a tough-minded optimism. And that is, I think Dave Mader and I both are very optimistic about our prospects for moving this forward, but we're also very realistic about the challenges. So one of the things that we did, and I'm kind of going to bounce around here a little bit, is here's our vision, which is to provide reliable, timely, secure, and consumable financial management data for the purpose of promoting transparency, facilitating better decision-making, and improving operational efficiency. And that can be then summed up with, what I got there, let's see, what do I want to do there? See, I'm great with technology. I'm shutting this down. That was great, huh? I don't know how I did that, but that's was miraculously with this little document right here. But we're going to reboot. That's the reset. Now you understand why data and technology is always not so easy. I'll blame myself. I'll take full responsibility. But I will. We can just keep. If you want to keep moving on this is fine. Which is better than something that better data, better decisions, better government, which I think are really very important concepts for us to be looking at. And it's really, again, we can really make government operate better if we have better access to data. Now, we at Treasury use data quite frequently. And if you want to look over my shoulder here and try to get us back on that, which is great. I mentioned the Treasury auctions that we do. I mentioned that these over $7 to $8 trillion of auctions. Well, we actually every day when we do those auctions put out machine-readable information that the markets use quite readily about those auctions. And that's one of the things the Act emphasizes is machine-readable. And I think that's very important so that people can use the data. Okay, great. Let's see where we go. Left and right, okay. So one of the things this is actually a great example, which is, technology was a little bit of a challenge here, but look how quickly we got back up, which is really, quite a remarkable thing. Okay, so I think also what we really tried to emphasize is how important it is for this data to be owned by the agency. So it's a data-centric approach. And one of the reasons why we do it, as many of you know, data quality is a huge issue. And part of the reason that there's data quality, getting back to the siloed systems, is there's not necessarily a cause and effect all the time of having high quality data in some systems because it's not necessary. Some of the data in those systems isn't necessary for those systems purposes. And so there's oftentimes, I'll give you an example. I mentioned the payments that come into the Bureau on the over 1 billion payments that come in. We have a new standard format, and that format actually has a lot of opportunity to provide information in that payment file that comes to us. But agencies really see no value in providing the information in that payment file that goes down to sort of a very granular level, in part because sometimes those payments are reclassified. During the course of the year, the payment will be made quickly, and then they'll come back and they'll reconcile it later and put it in the right place. So agencies don't have a lot of incentive at times to actually get that information precise. They get it right. They get it generally right, but the level of precision isn't necessarily something they're rewarded for in that payment file. And so, because they're not using that data in any meaningful way. So, one of the challenges you have is if that data is meaningful, or that information is meaningful, you will then populate that payment file with that information. And in some systems, I will assure you that that granular information exists in the agency. It is there. It's just not something that they necessarily have to put as part of the payment file. And so one of the challenges that we're saying is, one of the things we're talking about as data-centric is, we want to be able to map to that data, to that source, so that we can actually find a granular level of information more easily and more readily, rather than making large systems changes to actually capture the data in some other way. We have tried large systems changes efforts. I've been involved in several of them, which we've said to agencies, you need to change fields, you need to change things in order to actually report information to us in a different way. And in the course of those lessons that we've learned is that if you do that off cycle, it's expensive. If you do it on cycle, it's less expensive. If you deal with the vendors up front and you talk about it, you can make that change once rather than making it 24 different times or hundreds of times in different agencies. So there are ways to reduce the burden and the cost of actually making someone do systems changes, but it's still a systems change, and it still has expenses to it. Now, if the data ought to reside someplace and you have the ability to tag that data and extract it, well, then you've actually done something that's not particularly expensive. And one of the things that we've done over the course of last year, which I'm very proud of, is that we've done a number of pilots where we've actually tested this and said, you know, can you go out and sort of tag the data and then extract it and then use it and then present it in a very meaningful way. And so I think we've made some, we've made some real progress in that area. Standardized information exchanges, and then design and refine processes and systems to streamline reporting requirements and reduce compliance costs while improving transparency. I do think that when we've tried to do, we talked about the life cycle of spending, that you should actually be able to track spending from beginning to end. And I think that's a very worthy concept. It expands upon past legislation. Actually, our vision, I think, is even beyond what the Data Act has laid out, importantly, as something for us to aspire to. Okay. How do you, I think one of the things also, which is when you're, this is something which oftentimes, I don't know, I guess I'm kind of an operations guy in some ways, in which I understand that, you know, process is really important, and so how governance and project management and visions and direction are all things that are really important if you're going to be successful in a project. We established, you'll note that the legislation included Treasury as one of the lead on the bill, and we've taken that responsibility very seriously. So we started out and said the Executive Steering Committee is OMB and Treasury, as the legislation points out. We have lead responsibility, and Dave Mader and I have formed, I think, a really strong partnership in that Executive Steering Committee level of saying, you know, how do we want this to move forward within government? How can we be successful in implementing the Act? We decided, and we recognized, looking across the federal landscape, is that you have a lot of interagency advisory councils who are going to be fundamental to our success, whether it be the budget community, whether it be the grants community, the acquisitions community, the CIO community, the CFO community. And so we formed an interagency advisory committee which meets once a month, and actually more recently, a little bit more frequently, as we're coming up to May 8th, to May 9th, the one-year anniversary, to really bring them in on a regular basis and talk about how we're approaching the implementation of data and what's the expectations and how we can communicate with the federal communities to move the information out more effectively. So you see on the left-hand side, the lead is Treasury, set up a program management office, and to actually sort of really think about this, and OMB as well on the leadership side. And then we broke it down into 5 work streams, and it's the data definition standards, which you saw on May 8th. We issued a number of them, and also are trying to be forthcoming with more standards by the end of the summer. Treasury then set up a group which was blueprint roadmap between data elements, and this is what I was getting at, saying how important this is. What this group did, and it's really they did a wonderful job in my mind, is they went and looked and they said, look, if you look at these 57 data elements, where do they reside? Which systems do they reside in, sort of in a prototypical agency? Now, it may be a little bit different at Treasury than it might be at Commerce, but by and large, they're going to be pretty much standard with one another. And so what they did was they took the data elements and said, okay, they did these wonderful charts that you can look at, and they show the different systems and the flows, and they say, you know, if you're agency X, this is where that information resides, and this is where we think the authoritative source is going to be. And what you'll see is sometimes is the data resides in multiple systems, and you have to make a determination of which is the best system to actually extract that information from. If you're going to tag it, what's the right place to tag it? And so what they've done is they've given these roadmaps to the agencies and said, when you go out and start to look at where these data elements exist, here's a good starting point. And giving people kind of a leg up and sort of a head start on how to go about and do that. And it's been very, very successful. Treasury is responsible for data exchange standards, and we issued a notice of we issued some information on this about what exchange standards we think, and this is actually the sort of what language the information will reside in, so it can be reusable. That concept there about machine readable and reusable, this is the important element there. OMB has a pilot to reduce administrative burden. That's another one of the requirements of the Act. Some states, 25–30% of their GDP is federal grants. And so, you know, what you'll find is that we're a really important element in many states. And so, how that money flows to those states and the burden in which is applied is really important. And so, the states have been very interested in the Data Act and very much interested in participating and getting more information. In part because they want to set up their systems consistent with ours, to the extent that they're making changes. And then finally, there's Treasury and the data analytics. I'll talk about that in a little bit in a second, about sort of the do not pay and some of the things that we're doing within Treasury to attempt to improve our access to understand spending and reduce improper payments. We identified a senior accountable official from every agency. That tended to be sort of someone at the CFO level or higher, in which they are going to be responsible for bringing these teams together, which I'll talk about in a second, and asking them to actually push the effort forward within each agency. Finally, the Act talks a lot about consulting with industry, and that's why sessions like this are so important with the public and industry, is to get feedback about what we're doing. So you have, I don't know if many of you went to the Data Coalition event that occurred last week. I unfortunately wasn't able to make it, but many of our folks did attend, and I think that there was a really a lot of excitement that was at that session, and also I think it made us realize I think we're really on the right track. You know, there were people in the industry who were responding and actually coming up with creative ideas and innovative ideas about what they can do with our data. And that was very encouraging to us. I mean, I think it sort of shows that this thing is something that has value and can make an impact and will lead to outcomes perhaps that we can't anticipate today. And that's one of the things that we've been kind of very clear about is you can try to plan, and any good project plan sort of understands where it's trying to go. But as you're going along, you know there's going to be things that you find out that you can't anticipate. And sometimes that's really good, and you have to be flexible enough to kind of account for that and take advantage of it. And I think what we saw last week was very encouraging in that regard. The non-federal stakeholders, I mentioned states and interest groups. And then the last box item was something which I have not spoken much about, which is the federal lines of business, which is really important. We also have an OMB have initiative underway to move towards shared services. One reason why Treasury has an easier time with implementing the Data Act than many agencies is because we use a shared service provider. We use ARC within Treasury. It is much easier to get access to that data and to make these changes when you're using a shared service provider than when you have your own sort of systems that are sort of boutique homegrown systems, which oftentimes are hard to navigate and hard to sort of get into because of how they've been customized over the years. So the effort to move to shared service, centralized shared, has a number of advantages, and I can speak at great length on that, whether it be reducing an agency's IT footprint, whether it be reducing costs down the road about upgrades, whether it be reducing the risk of poor project management, whether it means you have an already configured system that is at your disposal rather than having to customize it. All these things are really important reasons why you move to a shared service provider regardless. But things like cybersecurity and things like compliance with the Data Act become much easier when you're using a shared service provider. The ability to actually access that information. So it really corresponds nicely with that. I'll come back just for a second to USA spending. I mentioned that we recently, Treasury took responsibility for USA spending about a year ago, and we relaunched the site recently. And I think one of the things that we learn about data and about presentation of data is they're basically fall into three categories. You have your casual user who comes to a site and says, I'm just interested in some information. And you can actually present that information to them, and they're quite happy with that. So that sometimes tends to be general public. You then have someone who wants to use the analytical tools that you provided on your site to drill more deeply into what the information that's on the site. And third, you have people who just want the data. Who just basically want to take that data and manipulate it or use it however way they want to use it and do the analysis themselves. They don't care about your tools. They just want to use the data itself. So as we designed this, I think we've tried to make some enhancements in terms of that second group about usability, and we learned some interesting things there as we went along, and with respect to how the site was being used, which are very informative as you're going forward in designing the ultimate site, as the legislation requires us to do, the Treasury to actually be presenting and providing the information to the public at large. I'm very, I think we've made a number of improvements in this area in terms of usability and access, and we were not, though, intending in any shape or form to improve the underlying quality of the data, and that's because the Data Act was really the more efficient way to get at that question, rather than trying to use the USA spending today and go to a separate initiative. Okay, I'm going to walk through just real quickly. I mentioned the standards that were released on May 8th, and more to come there. I don't think that that's the end of the process. I think it's the exact right starting place, and it will give give agencies an opportunity to sort of step forward and start to see where these data exists, where the data exists within their systems. We issued policy guidance about how do you want to move forward. The blueprints I mentioned earlier, of mapping where the data resides. The data exchange standards and the Data Act schema, as I spoke about earlier. And then the agency implementation playbook, which I want to spend a little bit of time on. Because I think this is critical about agencies as we were going through, and we got this from the Interagency Advisory Councils, were saying, okay, I kind of get conceptually where you're going, now tell me what to do. Give me direction exactly what you want me to do as an agency. And so we put a playbook together, and Treasury said, look, okay, you need to organize a team. You need to get a cross-cutting team that sort of, and it doesn't need to be a big team, it can be 4 or 5 people, who really is now dedicated to kind of advancing this within the agency. Review your elements. Take that blueprint I mentioned to you before about where do they exist. Take an inventory of your data along the way. Now design and strategize about what you want to do. Now this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, where you can do these first 4 steps pretty much given the guidance that we provided. The next piece, though, becomes a little bit more difficult, and that's to execute the broker, test the broker, and update systems and submit data. How we've approached this is that we want to put a data broker in the middle, and it's reusable code, it's open source coding, so that each agency can use it. And basically what this will say is that when you're actually able to tag and identify that data, you bring it into the broker then will translate it and make it usable for the public at large. I mean, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but that's kind of the idea. But what that means is you've done that mapping now. You've sort of said, this is where the information exists. Now you want to tag it, and you want to bring it back into the broker, and the broker will then help present it. It also will then allow you to start do business intelligence and data analytics at that phase, because now you have the data readily available to you along the way. Again, rather than having each agency go out and build this broker, or have each agency go out and think about about how they were going to do it, we sort of said, let's see if we can standardize this and make it readily available for all the agencies to use. Really significantly trying to reduce the cost. And once again, I'll come back to the point where we're saying tagging data is a lot less expensive than making systems changes. That's why the approach that we've tried to use is much more user-friendly that way. Okay. I know we're doing pretty well on time. There's a schema. As I mentioned, XBRL is the format that we've settled on, although that's flexible as well as we're going through. Let's see, data book, the playbook. I mentioned we have to finalize all the data standards by the end of the summer. We need to make sure that we're continuing to work with the agencies on the implementation plans. We have done a number of agency workshops to make sure they understand the concept as well as what it means practically for them. The data exchange, and then more outreach. I should also mention one of the things in this last point on outreach. We've been very pleased with using the GitHub as a means to actually go out and allow the community to participate in these discussions. So when we set the standards, we put the standards out on GitHub. We've said we're interested in your comments. Please comment on the standards. We've been able to take those comments, and to the extent that we can incorporate them, we'll incorporate them. And it's led to us not having to do, I think it's been a very efficient way to get feedback. It's been a very efficient way to engage communities in what we're doing, which I think is very important. We've also engaged 18F, who is doing a number of things, and they wrote an interesting blog, which I encourage you to take a look at, about some of the work that they're doing as how sort of this is a very innovative and new approach that we're taking. But they're also doing a number of research for us to sort of give us a better sense of who the users are and how the information that we're providing is going to be used, which I think is a very important element of actually ultimately designing the end website and of the USA spending. Okay, so let's see, I think I passed up on, I'll just talk a second finally about challenges that we have. I mentioned the size of the federal government and the complexity. There are budget constraints in agencies, there are resource constraints in agencies, there's complexities of the systems and the business processes across federal enterprises. Linking to financial and award data is a big deal, and something that we know is a challenge. And then we also have just generally change management. How do you get people to do things differently than they have in the past? So I'm going to pause there at the end. I know which will I think will leave much more an opportunity to talk about uses of the data and any other questions you have. So why don't I pause there first if there's questions about any questions you may have about how we're approaching the implementation.
Good morning. Rod Clark, I'm over at State Department of Diplomatic Security, and my organization provides cybersecurity training. So when you talk about the Data Act, you're talking about transparency, which from a security perspective typically would mean availability and access. Hence, the security bugaboos pop up.
Yep.
As a Tier 2 shared service providing cybersecurity training, that you had talked about with regard to shared services, what are your ideas on how to get the word out on that kind of program?
So I think that with respect to, there obviously, Congress and the executive branch make clear distinctions about what information should be in the public domain and what information should not be in the public domain. So I know we do that today in our reporting, and it's very important that we continue to pay close attention to that. I think that I wasn't quite sure with respect to your question on the cybersecurity, whether you were concerned about the ability to get to classified information, or you're concerned about the ability to somehow disrupt the information gathering process?
More on how to disrupt it and people's ability to manipulate it without authorization.
Yes.
When you're looking at big data analysis, that can really drive decision making.
Yeah, exactly.
And also the Tier 2 shared services side of it and getting the word out on that.
Yeah, I know that, and you well know, there's an enormous amount of tension today around cybersecurity, and I will assure you that that will be a significant element of our effort as well. I mean, it's just just in the last 3 or 4 weeks, as you well know, there's just so much more focus on what the new CIO is doing at the White House and a variety of other things, and how we do a better job across government of sort of tightening things up. And so that certainly will be part of anything as we're doing going forward.
part of the change management effort that you mentioned also involves getting leadership champions involved in organizations. You've identified the senior accountable officials. But one of the things, just saying, I'm Paul Ader, I work for Center for Organizational Excellence. One of the things we hear from agencies is they would like to see particular case studies as to where this type of data consolidation, specifically in the financial area of government, has led to specific ROI. And part of that storytelling appears to have been missing. There's a lot of logic. This will lead to effective results. But where has it led to effective results so that we can convince our leaders that this is the right way to go?
Sure. You know, I was coming over this morning and was thinking about the data that I had access to as commissioner of the Financial Management Service and then ultimately the Fiscal Service. And I'm not saying we're great at it, so I think all of us can improve. But we launched an initiative a number of years ago to go all electronic. And the initiative was, you know, how do you move people who are getting paper checks to get electronic checks? There's a whole number of reasons why you want to do that. It's safer, it's more secure, it's more efficient, all those things. What was really helped drive that was our ability to sort of say, how much does it cost to issue a check, right? And how much does it cost to actually do an ACH payment? And it turns out it costs well over $1 to do a check, and it costs, you know, around 10, 12 cents to do an ACH payment. That was very compelling in sort of convincing our secretary at that time, Secretary Geithner, that this was a high priority initiative that we should do because it would save $1 billion over 10 years across government and actually improve service to the citizens. So the ability to kind of go in and look at the information in your organization about how much you're spending on an activity can actually really drive your behavior. What we're doing in our do not pay area, which I mentioned I was going to talk about this earlier, is the ability to go in and sort of use the data and say, you know, what is going on with improper payments? How do we use that information, those analytics, to stop the number of improper payments that are being issued? How do we use data to do matching across payments and across databases to do more intelligence and more analytics around them? So there are things like that that are very important. I would say another example I saw the other day in terms of just generally around data was a discussion about credit card use across government and how, you know, advanced analytics, as they do in the private sector, can indicate where there's activity that's occurring that shouldn't be occurring on credit cards. You know, your own credit card company, I'm sure, has called you up when you're traveling abroad and you didn't report it, said, you know, I noticed that you just there's a charge in Europe. You know, is that you? We're shutting your account down. Well, there are different kinds of tools that you can do within the federal government similarly to take a look at, is there activity that's occurring? So about 2 weeks ago, our Inspector General honored folks in the Bureau of Fiscal Service because what they had done is they started to do better analytics about payment history. And so they've been identifying if a payment if multiple payments are going to one address like a P.O. box, maybe we should take a closer look at that. They used geospatial, sort of said, they went to the address and they say, well, that's a warehouse in the middle of Florida, that can't be where people live. And they referred that to the IG, and the IG prosecuted that case and was able to use that data in a way that said, this is activity that shouldn't be occurring. So I think that there's just enormous amount of opportunity in ways which you might be able to anticipate, and then ways you can't anticipate about how the data is going to be used. Now in federal spending, you know, again, getting back to the purpose of the Act, and I know Jeff is probably the one who's most keen on this point, is, you know, if you read the articles that Jeff has put together, there's another discussion about that. Well, how can the federal community make best use cases of this data on spending? And there are, you know, lots of discussions about, you know, I was able to figure out how much we were spending to issue a check, but do I know, for example, how much DOD is spending on making payments? So it's not just what my costs were in fiscal, but what the costs across government are for making payments. And right now it's very hard to do that. And so, you know, the Data Act is really about that, about being able to compare spending and expenditures across government, not simply just internally. Well, I feel like I can do a pretty good job internally of using the data that I have available to me to make my operation run better. I know I can't get very good information about what's happening across government, and I think that's one of the better use cases that you'll see as time goes on. And again, a lot of it's going to have to do with how you define program, how you define activity, object class, those kinds of things will have to be an important element of that.
Hi, I'm Larry we have just put a lot of our grant information online, and we spent a lot of time and development to try to make it usable. And we did find that it's the states who are getting the money who are using it, because, right, they can't see it. Somebody has the data, but, you know, it's not them, and it's not their office, and it's not the sub-grantees. So I was wondering, who do you find out of the three groups is really using your data? You've got your casual citizen, your partners, and then your data aggregators or users. Who are you finding is really using it, and what have they been doing with it?
So, you know, there were a lot more sort of power users than I don't know if that's the right term or not, but you know, there were a lot more people on the Hill that were actually accessing the data than you might expect, and trying to sort of understand what's going on in grants and spending. A lot of it is because they want to know what's going on in their congressional districts, right? So you're seeing a lot of that. You're right, the states are very interested too, because they don't necessarily always have great ways of tracking their spending, and so they too are really keenly interested in sort of seeing it aggregated and seeing in one place that they can get at it. The number of sort of researchers that are out there, I mean, I do know, I was doing a session about a year ago in which one of the audience members, and I was really pleased to hear this, he said he was using USA Spending to figure out like where activity was occurring in federal government and how he could bid aggressively on government contracts. And I thought that may not necessarily have been the reason why the Data Act was passed, but it has an potentially enormously powerful impact on government and the ability to reduce costs. So if you're getting more competitive bidding for whatever services that you're providing because someone has more transparency into it, that's good for the government. And so I would say that, you know, probably one of the unintended or maybe unanticipated, the power of that is probably not as well understood right now as it potentially could be when the data is more transparent. I think that will be a very good thing for government overall. How you're going to quantify that, I don't know. But I sort of have a feeling that that's where you're going to see a lot more activity as the data becomes more transparent and more accessible. I mean, already there's a couple of firms out there that are actually taking the data and putting together presentations to corporations and saying, you know, here's what HHS is spending, here's what Treasury is spending, here's what Commerce is spending, here's the areas they're spending money in. You know, if you're a corporation and you see that and you say, well, maybe I should be paying a little bit more attention about what Commerce is doing because I recognize that they're spending a lot of money in this area and I might not have realized it. So I think that's a you know, very positive aspect of what we may see with the more access to data.
Dave, we have a couple of questions from online viewers. One of them is, where can they find the data standards? That's an easy one.
So you can see them on the GitHub, let's see if I actually have the address here.
How about if you like, what we can do is within a couple of hours or so we can post these on both the REI website where you're viewing, as well as perhaps the Johns Hopkins website. I don't know if I can promise an hour or two turnaround.
Oh, probably nothing.
So we'll have them posted shortly. And the second question from an online viewer is, tell us a little bit about the pilots. How are they working? How can agencies see the results of the pilots that you've described?
So the GitHub, by the way, is fedspendingtransparency.github.io is the address. Actually, I thought it was maybe it's at the end here. I look at this, my last. There we go. I'm sorry, the second question was the pilots.
Results of the pilots.
Yeah. We have an effort underway with SBA right now, and they've been, I think, you know, very forward thinking on this. They put together a very small team of around 5 people, what we're trying to do in that pilot is to see whether we can identify where the information exists in their various systems and tag that data and then attempt to put that into the broker and present the information. And we're at the we've used an agile approach, which is sometimes a little bit different in government as well. Oftentimes you'll hear about a waterfall approach, and that's where you hit a stage, and you go to the next stage, and you go to the next stage. This is sort of sprints of, you do something, you see what happens, you adjust, you do some more things, you see what happens, and you adjust. And so the pilot has had a very sort of tight window around it, but it's been going very well. It's very encouraging from our perspective on what it means about the ability to sort of translate this to more, that whether this concept actually can work for government as a whole. And right now the results are very encouraging. I think we have ways to go, and I mentioned my tough-minded optimism. Well, there's questions that we have to ask and things which we'll have to work out. But it really did follow the playbook. I mean, the 8 steps I mentioned there, they sat down and kind of walked through and said, put the team together, small team. Okay, where's the data reside? Okay, how do we map it? Okay, how do we move to those phases 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, which I mentioned earlier, a little bit the tougher pieces. How do you actualize those things? So again, more to come. We're not done yet, we're sort of in the middle of it right now. But so far, it looks very encouraging. We also, by the way, did a mapping just to sort of the concept on something we call the GTAS, our trial balance information, which we did earlier, which was a little bit more at a summary level. This was one of the earlier pilots, and that too yielded the same results that we hoped, which was could you tag the data and could you extract it effectively, and the answer turned out to be yes.
If an agency were to say, hey, I'm about to start this next step, is there someone at SBA I could talk to, or is there someone on your staff they could talk to say how did they overcome a particular challenge?
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned the workshops and the work that Christina Ho and her team is doing. That information is all there. So when an agency comes in and says, I'm ready to go, there's a source that sort of says, okay, we're there to help, and let's move this along. And interesting enough, and I'll come back to this, this has been kind of one of the most, I don't want to call it surprising, but it certainly has been very promising to the extent that the number of agencies have been moving out on these things and are eager to move forward and looking for the guidance. Been pretty remarkable in my mind that something that was not a piece of legislation that wasn't necessarily warmly embraced initially, given the scope of it and given the fact that there wasn't funding attached to it. It's been kind of remarkable how agencies have sort of seen the power of it and said, yes, I want to get going.
Other questions from the audience, or would you? So I have a couple of questions, although they may or may not deal with this, what you've described so far. Or is there more you want to share?
No, unless you have any other questions, let's keep going.
So let me ask, and this one is something that I think kind of is along the lines of potential next steps. And the question is essentially, agencies right now are allowed to define their own list of programs. And the example I like to give is water quality. So the Environmental Protection Agency may say, well, our water quality program is about water quality measurement. And on the other hand, the Army Corps of Engineers is about water quality operations. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is about educating farmers about how to improve water quality with respect to reducing pollution and runoff. But if they each define it separately, it may be difficult for us to get a picture of what all agencies are involved in water quality, who perhaps is achieving the best results. Are there perhaps opportunities for them to collaborate or to learn from each other? So the question is, there are... I
thought it was me.
I'm sure it's me.
There's a smartphone near my
BlackBerry or phone?
Yeah.
Is this a smartphone?
Oh, yeah.
Does it?
Probably. Or yeah.
Technology.
So the question is,
That was my encrypted BlackBerry, by the way.
over a period of time, will there be any evolution in the Data Act's approach to program definition that would allow an easier kind of identification of similar programs or similar activities, for example, across government?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is yes. But I think that the initial stage right now is really trying to make sure we get the foundation in place. I have no doubt there's going to be an evolutionary process in terms of whether it be more standards get identified beyond the initial ones that we've established, or alternatively that the definitions start to adjust to make them more kind of appropriate to where things are. I think the question that will come up, and sort of pushing toward that standardization you're talking about in terms of definitions, I think part of that will come out of experience. You know, if you get the foundation in place and you're looking at some place like SBA, and then you start to compare it to data from another grant-making organization like education, or a loan entity, you'll start asking that question. Well, you know, do we have anomalies here? This is an issue that the acquisitions and the grants community wrestle with all the time, because their systems define things differently for different purposes. And it's one of the reasons why, when I mentioned the Interagency Council, when we've been doing the standards, one of the things that we've done is we've taken those councils and we've sat them in rooms and said, you guys have got to sort of hash this out. Deadlines are really helpful in that regard, because quite frankly, these communities have been hashing this out for a while now. And so the deadlines have really started to say, no, you've got to start to come to some kind of convergence on this. What Dave and I have said is, you guys can't come to a conversion on it, we'll make the decision. You might not like it, but we'll make it. It may not be a well-informed decision, but it will be a decision, and you'll have to move forward. And that, by the way, has been very effective. But your point's a good one, and I think it's you know, I think in terms of sort of putting building blocks in place, I'm not so sure we're there yet, to the extent of saying that we really fully understand how many differences there are, and to the extent that we can say today, no, you need to do it exactly this way so you can do more standard, you can do more comparison. I also, though, think that the way we've approached this with the tagging means that if we don't get it 100% right, it's possible that you can make an adjustment at a later point along the way and actually find the data more defined more clearly or more similarly across agencies. But I think it's going to be something, I think it's one of those things where that's one of those more to come, and I don't think it's in this first phase we're going to get exactly right out of the box. I mean, it won't be perfect out of the box.
So I was curious, being that I direct the Johns Hopkins Master of Science in Government Analytics, what should universities, and in particular programs such as the one that I direct, focus on to help prepare students to meet some of the challenges that you've outlined today?
You know, it's really interesting, because I think a lot of the good ideas that have come are from people who are looking at things differently. And I mean, I would tend to give kind of more broad sweeping advice, which is that this is an area that is very under-resourced within government, and the ability to kind of drive more analytics is going to be a huge growing area going forward, and to kind of bring those skills. I mentioned our debt collection program, and about 4 years ago, quite frankly, we really weren't quite sure what we were doing. We knew we needed to do something. So we basically said, you know, let's just put together a really small team and have them just go at it. You know, just sort of, and the interesting part about it is our initial reaction was go at it because we wanted them to look at the debt portfolio to sort of see if there was different trends and things we could see with respect to managing the delinquent debt of the federal government. When they got in the organization, their skills were so desperately needed as they were being asked to do 1,000 things. I mean, once people saw that they were good and they knew what they were doing, they were being asked to do, you know, every part of the organization virtually was saying, can you come here and help me address this question? And there just weren't enough of them. So they got a little bit diverted from the original purpose, but it did show us that this is a skill that, you know, everyone, our senior leadership clearly saw it. I mean, they clearly saw that we weren't doing enough with the data that we had and weren't being very effective at sort of making use of that data in a particular way. So my advice would be sort of a general way is you know, this is going to be a really growing field, if not only, it's a growing field not just in government but across industry as well. How do you, I mean, I'm running a project right now which a new retirement account, and just kind of give you a feel for, you know, data analytics. It's a retirement account for people who don't have access to a pension plan in their workplace, and so we've introduced something called the MyRA, and it's my retirement account, and individuals can save up to $15,000, at which point we turn them over to the private sector. But one of the things that we're finding is who are the people who this is most interesting to, right? How can we change behavior? And so historically, government, when I look at something like, well, it's money, if you look at the private sector, how much money do you think GEICO spends a year on advertising, by the way? Does anyone know the answer to this? They spend $900 million a year on advertising. Wow, right? And That's why you see a Geico commercial, like, you know, everywhere you go, baseball game, you see Geico. Well, the federal government's not going to spend $900 million to introduce MyRA. And yet, historically, what you would do is, I mean, how many people have seen the Prudential commercials, you know, of saying save for retirement? They're spending probably close to $100 million on that. We're not going to be able to do that. So what we need to be able to do is find out who's the audience. You know, what are the characteristics of the people who might be interested in this account? How do we get to them? How do we target and market to them? And it really is all about data analytics. I mean, it's just a heavily data analytics driven kind of approach. And so whether it be the Data Act, whether it be introducing a new retirement account, you know, these are things that the government has a desperate need to actually use the analytics to drive decisions and drive behavior. And with respect to the MyRA, as I know, we're not going to be able to spend $80, $90 million to introduce that product. So we have to figure out how we most effectively use that dollar to approach someone, and that's going to be the analytics which is going to do that.
Yeah, so my takeaway from what you're saying is that the key is to focus on transferable skills, so skills and knowledge that can then be applied to a variety of different substantive areas, so that people can be sort of pulled in as needed.
Especially, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think that, you know, it's funny because we tried to figure out what the right characteristics were. We actually, when we first hired that team, we went heavily on economists. We hired 2 economists, which was good, but strong analytical skills, period, is what kind of rounds that team out. And they have been used in any. I mean, they were not. As I guess my point would be to pick up on your point, which is they ended up being used for not the purposes they were hired for. Rhonda?
I would just add to that, being the person responsible for managing that team, is the ability to prioritize all of the requests that come across their path, because there are a lot of requests, and distinguishing between how do you need to use those skills, those advanced higher level analytical skills, as opposed to just kind of your straightforward analytical skills that you would expect in all your employees to be able to look at data and operationalize that or figure out, you know, how to use that data. So being able to really understand the business, I don't think they necessarily have to focus on a business going through college or deciding this is going to be my area, but being able to quickly learn a business and understanding that business will help them tremendously, and then being able to prioritize, this is where I think we need to put those advanced analytical skills and give you your biggest bang for your buck. And one other thing I might add is a successful experiment might not lead to a new program. It might lead to not doing certain things, and that can be just as successful.
I would also say just when we established that program, we contemplated going one of 2 ways. We actually did have people apply to the program who were modelers, and we decided against that because we thought it would get too granular and too bogged down, where I think you need a balance between analytics in a general way and skill in a specific way.
Hi, I'm Nicole from Partnership for Public Service, and I was wondering, as far as change management goes in the shared services process, when you guys are choosing the councils and committees, who do you decide to be the leaders of that, and have you seen transparency going down through those leaders?
So the communities that were here on that chart are well established who actually do have a chair. And so they're usually voted on by the members of the various, you know, or someone actually sometimes volunteers, sometimes is volunteers for them.
Okay.
So they end up being designated as the leader of those communities. And that's why we brought them in and basically said, okay, now your responsibility. We asked them to do 2 things when they came into the Interagency Advisory Council. We brought that high-level council up. We asked them to do 2 things. We asked them to bring their expertise as a federal employee, as a senior manager, from their experience to help us. But we also then said, but you're also representing your community. So, you know, we're asking them to wear 2 hats. We were saying, you know, what do you know from your experience that can be useful to us? But also, when we're providing information to you, you then need to translate that back into your communities. And if you don't, you know, we also showed up at many of those communities too. We would do road shows in which staff would show up and say, let me explain the Data Act, and that was very useful in terms of making sure it wasn't just them having to translate, but also that they were getting information directly from the program team and the Treasury team on the left over there.
I have another question from an online person. This one, beware, is from GAO. The question is, how was public input considered in the data standards that were issued on May 8th? And I'll just add my own supplement to that. Can you give an example?
I mentioned the GitHub and that process. The first standards that were put out actually, for example, executive compensation had been something that had been talked about for quite some time. There had been notices of proposed rulemaking, so there was an enormous amount of input that had gone into that process that predated the Data Act. So so when we got to that one was, we kind of got as much input as we need. We're not gonna, we'll put it out there, and there maybe something new will come up, but it really went through a very sort of a standard government process to come up with those standards. The GitHub, I actually can't say that I went on the GitHub every day or often to sort of see what comments were coming in, and maybe Christina or Amy can have some inputs on into sort of, this was a process driven more by OMB than it was by Treasury because of the role. So I don't know to what extent, we got a lot of comments in that process, but the GitHub was generally the area where we were looking for those things. And I don't know if Amy or Christina, would you have anything to add with respect to, you guys were probably following a little bit more closely than I was on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I get every email.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there most of the standards that are less controversial, we generally don't get too many comments, so those are pretty easy to move them forward. But there are comments, there are data standards like the entity identifier that I saw many comments on, and those we definitely then sit down and go through all the comments to make sure that we address them, either not necessarily incorporate all of them, but making sure that whatever we put out, we not only explain what the standards are, but also explain why it didn't include some of the comments that have been submitted. So that's the process that we go through.
Yeah, and that actually, Christina triggered in my mind. Yeah, there have been a number of standards. I will say, this has been very positive. When you do an effort like this, it's sometimes criticism focuses your mind more. Probably more so than praise in many cases. But I think that there have been a number, there have been a number of standards that have been out there that have grabbed a fair amount of attention. And she mentioned one of them on the identifier. And I think that has helped sort of us focus more on, we really do need to address that issue. And that we need to make sure that, and it's a complicated issue, so that's one of the ones that's a little bit harder, how you get into the sort of a long history about how that identification process is being done today, and are there ways to make it more, like the legislation encourages, open, non-proprietary standards. I mean, that's one of the legislation actually says, you need to find non-proprietary standards. And so that's one of the ones where the comment period has been very helpful to us to kind of get a sense of what potentially the options are, some solutions are, and the importance of getting it right. Because researchers and others don't want to pay for information, and I think that's fair. They don't want to pay for public information. And so for our ability to kind of address that issue is really an important one. And that's come through loud and clear in the GitHub comment period.
So, Dave, let me ask, following on one of your comments earlier about kind of how do you measure the return on investment, and you're pointing out the example of cutting a check costs more than $1 and an ACH, automated clearinghouse transfer costs about 12 cents. That kind of would be my idea, which is we've got an activity, making a payment, and we've got presumably some way to capture costs, whether it be employee labor, whether it be systems and technology, or perhaps even the facility and the paper of the check. And we've got different agencies or different parts of an agency with different ways of doing it. But it seems to me like for the Data Act, we're going to start capturing the spending on a consistent basis. But in order to get what you've just described, we'd have to know the performance. In this case, the output of how many checks we cut. And my fear is that in that example, it may be a little easier, and that might be something you and your agency at FMS or within the Fiscal Service can do. But there may be other examples like that, whether it be operating a square foot of building, or making a credit card transaction, or even kind of again within FMS, the question of how efficient are we at collecting debt? And in private sector, there are some very specific measures about, how much does it cost you to collect a dollar's worth of debt, depending on the quality of the debt. And so my question is, will there eventually, in some sort of horizon, and I recognize it's not going to be 6 months or a year, but will there in some sort of horizon, and would you care to put a speculation on that horizon, be an ability to say, here's an apples-to-apples basis, perhaps even on just some of the financial measures, like, we're going to collect the cost to cut a check, or the cost to make a payment. We're going to figure out, what is it that means a payment, or what is it that we're going to use standard definitions to be able to talk about debt collection, who's most efficient at it, and then learn how. Is there some sort of horizon where you see those kind of performance data being standardized as well across government?
I don't hesitate, I've been so focused pretty much on the implementation of the Data Act that question, which is really not necessarily explicitly part of the Data Act, has not been something that, in my mind, I've sort of said, okay, but other than this, it will follow. It will inevitably follow. I think that what time frame it follows, I don't know. But I think that the very logical evolution is better data is going to lead to that exact conversation. It will, by necessity or very logically, lead to that conversation. And so I don't know what time frame that will be, how it will actually flow, but I think it's a natural evolution of it.
Who are the users or the constituents you see that might call for that?
I think it'll be a combination. Obviously, I mentioned that when I was reading the Act itself, you had the Hill, and then there's lots of discussion about taxpayers and policymakers that will be calling for that. I hope, if it's going to actually work, it needs to be federal employees who ask that question. It needs to be the decision makers and agencies, because I know that you can comply with a piece of legislation to satisfy the letter of the law, and if it's a compliance effort, it will be executed one way. If it's an effort that says it really has meaning, it'll be executed another way. And I think one of the major accomplishments that we've had so far is it's being implemented right now that it has meaning. So your question would be the same thing, which is that will flow if it has meaning to the people who actually have to present the data and use the data on a daily basis. That's when you'll have that sort of say, okay, I get it.
I think that question is very important, and one thing I want to ask you about is, as we look at performance data beyond financial data, your focus has been on financial data, which of course is very, very important, but there's an incredible amount of performance data which is not specifically financial, but is very key to evaluating operational efficiency and mission accomplishment. And what we have found in looking at various programs is that there are certain programs like Treasury that offer a service that other agencies can use, but in some agencies the level of sophistication of analysis of the data is greater than the central system, so that I wonder, is there a need for a dialogue that goes two ways, so that whoever is developing a central system, be it Treasury or someone else, would be learning from how the other agencies have developed these data, so that there is a difficulty with distributed databases that are not continuous and often reflect legacy priorities. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there may be some legacy that's useful, and I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I think I'll come back to emphasize one of your points, is by making it data-centric and agency-centric, what you're trying to do is give the agencies the tools to actually do the kind of analysis and to do the kind of using the data that's most useful to them. So while we talk about presenting the data through Treasury and kind of USA spending, the underlying premise of this is that data is owned by the agency. And the agency is the one who ultimately can use the business intelligence tools, can use the analytical tools to actually make better use of that data for their purposes. Yes, of course, the Data Act talks about trying to take that data and be able to apply it across government. But again, at the end of the day, if this is going to be powerful for the agencies, it can't be a Treasury or an OMB database. It's got to be an agency, it's got to be agency-driven. And sort of that philosophy, I think, will help kind of lead to what you're talking about. I will also say one other thing is that, which has been kind of an interesting example, is Dan Tagliani at GSA and Beth Colbert at OMB wanted to do a benchmarking effort. And one of the things that Dan said, which at the time I thought was not so sure I agreed with it, he basically said, look, I don't care necessarily initially about the quality of the data. Let people throw stones at it, let people, criticize it. The first step is just get the data, right? Get data out there. And then see where the things fall, because it will lead you to interesting questions. It will then lead you to try to refine the data. It will ask you, I'll give you an example. One of the pieces of data that came back to Treasury is about how much money we were spending on HR. Okay, and so you can say, well, HR, it's too expensive, it's too complicated. Well, you start to dig down deeper in what you're spending on HR. Part of HR is training, right? So is a high number good or bad? It's an interesting question. The answer may be a high number in training is a really good number. Now, if you're delivering your training inefficiently and you're not getting results, then it's a bad number. But it also may turn out to tell you is it's a good number because it means you're reinvesting in your employees, you're making sure your employees have the skills, and you're able to perform your mission better. So it was those kinds of things, which is, I don't know the right answer to all those things, but that was sort of, I think, a really kind of important thing. And I would say the same thing with the Data Act is get the data going. It may lead to uncomfortable questions, it may lead to us, but it may lead to very interesting paths that will give us better decisions in the future.
So I think that's time, so thank you very, very much. Let's give our speaker a Jeff has a small token of appreciation for you, I believe. Thank you.
Under $25.
And we certainly hope you'll join us again. Our next event will be in September, and the specific date will be determined. So watch your emails and our websites. So again, thank you for coming.